Well, hello and welcome to asiCast 182. I'm Richard Marks, ASI's Research Director, and this episode is the last in a run of podcasts previewing our conference in Venice, in which we've been chatting with speakers at the upcoming conference. So today I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Valerie Morrison, who is Managing Director at CESP. So hello, Valerie.
Good morning, Richard.
Now, just in case listeners don't know CESP, what's your main focus of activity?
Well, our main focus of activity is the audit of all audience measurement currencies in France, but we also do audits abroad. We've worked in 25 countries so far. So we do audits as well as certification programs, mainly in France.
Okay, now you'll be telling delegates at this year's conference about the results of a work group that CESP set up to look at best practice in measuring attention, which is obviously something the industry is becoming increasingly focused on. Can you tell us a little bit about how the group came about?
Yes, well, it started in April 2023. IREP, who is the equivalent of ARF in France, organized a conference on the quality of contacts. Andy Brown, by the way, presented a paper on attention and attack at the time. And at the end of the conference, there was a discussion between participants about quality of contacts and should there be an industry discussion on that. And as IREP and CESP are two association, non-profit, expert and neutral, we thought we were a good forum to organize this type of discussion. So we organized this work group a year ago with different objectives. One was to reach definition, a shared definition of attention across media, also to work on some indicators and to share best practices. And we've just published a white paper on that.
So we'll be coming at the conference quite soon after the paper's been published.
Exactly. This will be the first presentation for foreign public.
Yeah, I don't want to preempt obviously the presentation too much, but there's one or two interesting topics that we could talk about here. But I think firstly, why do you think attention has become such a hot topic for the industry in recent years?
Well, I think there are different reasons. There is clearly increased advertiser interest in that. In a context of economic uncertainty, there is an increased financial pressure to optimize media spend. And advertisers want to prioritize quality inventories, and attention is seen as a KPI they can optimize on to make their advertising work harder. And I think another reason has to do with sustainability. The idea is that by optimizing on attention, you are going to spend less, but better, and reduce your carbon footprint. And I think also maybe a last reason is that, digital players have put the focus on attention in recent years, and viewability has become a prerequisite integrated in programmatic tools. And it's not sufficient anymore for advertisers to guarantee effectiveness. So attention has become the sort of new graal. And in digital, there are many different measures and approaches to measure attention. And given, attention has become almost a buzzword, but hiding many different approaches. And traditional media, although I don't like this word of traditional, but more incumbent, if you want, media, have reacted and launched initiatives and measures. So there's really an abundance of approaches today.
I think one of the key things that we'll be talking about more widely, not just in your paper at the conference, is the topic you really just highlighted, which is what is attention. Because, for example, you mentioned that the advertisers think, well, that means they'll be able to spend less but more wisely on advertising. But clearly, there are a number of media owners who are very keen on attention because they see it as a way of demonstrating that they're premium environments, that somehow that they get better attention levels than other media. Do you think that there is a qualitative versus a quantitative difference going on here, because if I speak to a number of people, particularly in the US, when they're talking about attention, they really meaning eyeballs on screen, moving beyond presence in the room. That advertisers should only pay for attentive viewing. In other words, it's a way of narrowing the definition of viewing, as opposed to, I think the sell side, I think, see it more as a kind of a media planning tool that allows you to say this medium will give me better qualitative, metrics on attention. Did you get into that in the discussion about what, which of
Yes,
those?
yeah, it's a very good point you're making, and I think there can be different levels of attention. And Karen Nelson-Field showed in a book on the attention economy that you can have some effectiveness even with low level of attention, sort of passive attention, because your eyes are not necessarily focused directly on the ad, but you can still have some effectiveness with a low level of attention. There's a graph in a book where you see that the biggest gap, the biggest impact for the brand is between zero attention and low attention level. Obviously, you get the higher level of effectiveness if you get to a high level of attention, when people's eyes are really focused on the ad, sorry. But you have the biggest increase between no attention and low attention. So I think low attention can be interesting as well.
I guess that also leads on to the fact that I think your initiative isn't just focused on TV and video. It's been looking across, all potentially all media. And I know we've had representatives from the radio industry on the podcast making the very point that, visual attention is irrelevant when you get into media like audio media, for example. Was there any discussion about how audio in particular fits into this idea of attention?
Yes, that's a good question. And in our work group, we had representatives from all media, advertisers and agencies. So obviously this topic was on the table. We talked a lot about visual attention and eye tracking, which is a dominant methodology today. And the radio people were always saying, but it doesn't apply to us. That's an issue. But maybe tomorrow, I know some vendors work on this topic of audio. Maybe tomorrow there will be a passive way of measuring attention on audio, but it doesn't exist today. So this is why one of the conclusions of our work group was that, in fact, today, the only common measurement possible across media is claimed measurement, is survey-based. That's it may be a bit frustrating, but it's the only way today to really have, and many media agencies use surveys to get attention level across all media. When they want to benchmark and compare all media, that's often what they use.
So I know that I used to have a colleague, a guy called Robert Heath, who had this concept that was very popular, which was called low involvement processing, which was kind of the idea that a lot of advertising works at a subconscious level. And even if you're not necessarily thinking you're hearing an ad, it kind of seeps in, particularly for audio. That was quite popular. The trouble was that what it really meant was that you couldn't be asking people about ads they heard on the radio, because they might say, no, I didn't hear it, when actually they kind of had. And his argument was that really the only two things you could measure were listening and the final purchase, and everything else in between was hard to measure. And there was a lot of interest in it, but the problem was it kind of was self-defeating, because basically it was saying there is no point doing research, because all you really need is listening figures and purchase, and everything else in between is.
Yeah, well, it's true. No, it's very interesting. It's true that when you interview people, it's mainly conscious attention or perceived attention that you're going to measure. So, as you say, subconscious processes you will not necessarily get through a survey. So, and that's a limit that we pointed in the white paper. For each approach, we talked about the benefits and the limitations with the work group. So that's in the white paper. But, at the same time, we have to work with what we can, and it remains interesting. And when you have high attention, then you are able to, mention your attention to the media in a survey. So it still has some value. One thing for surveys, what we insisted on in the white paper is the importance of asking the question with maybe an attitudinal or behavioral scale rather than a numeric scale, and also to be as close as possible to the exposure to the ad. Talk about the last occasion when you listen to the media, or to be as close as possible to usages to avoid this lack of memory.
Yeah, the memory decay, I think, is
memory decay. Yeah,
quite a challenge as well.
Mm.
In terms of, I guess there's two aspects that possibly you're going to be talking about in Venice. I mean, one is the methodology, how you actually gather the data, whether it's a questionnaire or whether it's eye tracking approaches like T-Vision, who we've had at the conference before now, Lumen, and the work that Nelson Field is doing, which are all subtly different in terms of the methodology.
Mhm.
But in terms of the actual metric, has there been much conversation in your working group about what a metric might look like, an agreed actual figure?
What we think is that it's the next step of our work group. The first step was to have a common definition and to identify some indicators and start thinking of best practices. But you're right, the next step will be to work on metrics. The thing we approached on this topic of metrics is the topic of thresholds. Because we worked a lot on duration of attention, which is one of the indicators, with eye tracking, how long you are attentive to an ad. And because, today, some vendors, they use 0.1 second to start counting attention. And there was a lot of debate in the work group to say, well, is that sufficient? And we looked at many articles by neuro experts and discussed with neuroscientists, and we think it's really too low. And what we propose is to define different levels, different thresholds. One would be sort of consciousness of attention. When your brain start being aware of something, you're not necessarily able to talk about it, but your brain starts noticing something. And what we found is that this threshold could be from 0.3 seconds for an image, but more like 1 second for video. And then we thought maybe we need to also think of a threshold linked to effectiveness or useful attention, if you want. And that the work group was talking more about 2 to 3 seconds. So that's the closest we got towards the idea of a metric. We thought, well, there is a need as an industry to define some thresholds, to start counting attention, and maybe think of a threshold for useful attention or an attention which is likely to lead to effectiveness. But that's the next step of our work. And I don't know whether we should do it at a national level or a global level, because I think it's a topic in many countries. So it might be interesting to have international discussion about these, about the metrics.
Yeah, I'm sure we will at the event, definitely be talking about that. I guess the one question I've got would be about whether it needs to be standardized or not, which might seem a strange question, but normally things are standardized because they're going to be in a currency. and
Mhm.
people have to be able to trade and
Mhm.
have a common definition. Whereas if attention is mainly about media planning, then it may just be up to each individual agency, how they want to define attention. Why would you need to standardize it unless it's actually going to be traded alongside, TVRs and
Mhm.
reach and things like that, which is unlikely, because I can't see a situation where a currency like Barb or Médiamétrie is going to
Mhm.
agree overnight that we're going to start trading much lower figures because we're going to bake attention
Yes.
in.
Yeah,
So,
well, I agree with you. I mean, audience is one thing, and then attention is something different. I don't think we should mix the two. That's for sure. Attention is more like an additional layer you can add on top of, contact or opportunity to see. But at the same time, we in our work group we discussed with advertisers, big advertisers like Danone, and they said, for the same campaign with different vendors they use, they don't get the same level of attention, and that's an issue for advertisers. So I think there is still a need for some form of standardization, like, when you start counting attention, when you work with eye tracking, some have 0.1, others 0.2. That I think there is some need of standardization. I don't say everything should be the same, but from an advertiser point of view, I understand that there is a lot of confusion around attention today because it's such a buzzword that if you look specifically at digital, what you call attention is different from one company to the other, especially with companies in ad verification. You take, for example, a score of 100. For some of them, it's the average score. For others, it's the maximum score. And when you look at what they put in attention, there is a mix of different things. Some are explanatory variables of attention. There's sometimes a bit of eye tracking, and it's really a mix. And I think there is a need for some clarification on that, because for me, what they do sometimes is more, I mean, it's interesting, but it's a measure of quality of inventory rather than attention, as you may think of attention as something between your exposure to an ad and effectiveness measurement. And then you have this attention level, which is interesting to measure. But I think there is a lot of confusion today in the digital space about attention.
will you all be talking about this in a Wednesday afternoon joint session where we have both the audio and the video delegates come together? Because you are talking, more than just about video specifically. We've
Mhm.
also got on the Friday advertising session 3 papers around attention. We've got Karen Nelson-Field, who you mentioned, who actually featured in the last podcast before you that we
Okay.
we've published. We've also got Jill McGrath from Tam Island.
Mhm.
From Canada, we've got Pat Pellegrini of Vividata and Josh Jason from slightly lower down in the US, lower down geographically, I mean,
Yes.
who'll be talking about attention versus resonance. So it's definitely going to be a big theme at the event. Finally, just thinking more widely as a delegate as well as a speaker, what do you think are the big topics that you're looking forward to talking about in Venice, aside from attention?
Mhm. Well, I'm really looking forward to this year's conference because for me, there's a big topic, maybe what you could call a political issue. I hope to get at ASI a feel for the industry appetite for shared metrics that require consensus. Um, for many years, the advertising industry and trading has been based on shared numbers provided by currency measurement solutions funded by all stakeholders. And with the debate on cross-media today, we see that there is a difficulty to agree on common metrics between TV broadcasters and platform. So one question I hope to get an answer to at ASI is, can we be optimistic and hope that we will reach a consensus and continue to have shared metrics on cross media, for example, or is there a risk of having multiple metrics tomorrow, many different approaches globally, but also in a given country? And I don't think that's good for an advertising industry, to have different measurement in parallel. I think there are different forces today, and I hope that I will get the feeling, is there still industry appetite for these common measures and these shared metrics?
Yeah, that's definitely going to be a big theme, I think, throughout all 3 days. So, yeah, well, we look forward to getting your contribution to that debate, as well as your feedback on the attention initiative in France. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you and hopefully a lot of the listeners in Venice in early November.
Thank you, Richard. See you then.